The concept of God is really a method of accounting for the nature of things. In the early days, people didn't know enough about how things formed, how nature worked, so they invented their own little stories.
A cursory glance at the suppressed history of religion reveals that even the foundational myths themselves are emergent culminations, developed through influence over time.
And then on Easter Sunday, then they kill the wild boar that killed Tammuz and eat ham on Easter Sunday.
Pergamum was the center of the Semiramis worship. The Semiramis worship was of Semiramis and Tammuz, mother, Semiramis, Tammuz, son.
Welcome to Making a Mess of Potamia, the segment where we aim to debunk and demystify the myths surrounding ancient Mesopotamia. Today's mess is an Easter Sunday extravaganza. Comparative mythology at its best is one of the most illuminating ways to study the ancient world. By setting myths side by side, we can start to see the big questions that human beings across cultures have pretty much asked for millennia. Where did we come from? What happens when we die? How do we live in harmony with the divine? How do we live in harmony with nature or even each other? It's a method that opens up conversation between cultures and time periods, helping us understand not just what myths say, but why they matter. For instance, individuals like Joseph Campbell popularized this approach for modern audiences in his idea of a universal monomyth that is the hero's journey, captured the imagination of everyone from academics to screenwriters. And suddenly myths from ancient Sumer and classical Greece to medieval Europe and modern cinema all seem to be telling the same story in different clothes. But here's the thing. That kind of sweeping comparison can be both useful and dangerous. When done thoughtfully, comparative mythology can help us see shared human concerns expressed in mythic form. But when done sloppily or overzealously, it risks flattening out the rich diversity of cultural thought. It can blur essential differences in language, nuance, ritual, and cultural worldview. In the worst cases, it ends up turning myths into little more than plot summaries, ignoring the deeply embedded meanings that they held for the cultures that created them, past, present, and even the future. Now, the goal of comparative mythology is fairly straightforward: to examine the similarities and differences between myths from different cultures, often in search of underlying patterns or shared archetypes. Early proponents of this approach, like Max Muller in the 19th century, believed that myths were symbolic expressions of natural phenomenon. From sunrises to storms to changing seasons, he famously declared that mythology is a disease of language, suggesting that over time poetic metaphors became misunderstood as literal stories about gods and monsters and heroes. Later thinkers took a psychological approach. Carl Jung, for instance, proposed the idea of the collective unconscious, a set of archetypes common to all humanity, regardless of origin, which he believed expressed themselves through dreams and myths and religious symbols. Going back to Campbell, he followed Jung's lead, focusing on what's now known as the hero's journey, a narrative arc involving a call to adventure, trials and ordeals, a climactic victory, and a return home that leaves the protagonist wholly transformed. In fact, his own book, The Hero with a Thousand Faces, became widely influential, not just in academia, but in pop culture. George Lucas famously used Campbell's ideas when he crafted the original Star Wars trilogy. Since then, Campbell's monomyth model has been taught in schools, used in screenwriting courses, and pretty much found its way into mainstream thinking about myth, media, and its relation to the human experience. But even as Campbell's ideas gained popularity, critics began to raise important questions. One of the biggest problems with comparative mythology is that it can easily drift into oversimplification. When myths are reduced to shared themes or story beats, their unique cultural context gets lost. And that context is everything. Let's look at a common example: the myth of Inanna's descent into the underworld. In this ancient Sumerian story, the goddess Inanna, queen of heaven and earth, descends into the realm of the dead, seeking to extend her power. Through the course of her journey, she's stripped of her garments, judged by her sister Ereshkigal, and killed. And after 3 days and nights, she's rescued, but only by sacrificing another, her husband, Dumuzid, who then becomes part of a seasonal cycle of life, death, and return. It's a powerful tale about death, power, sacrifice, gender, and cosmic balance, but it's often co-opted into comparisons with Jesus' resurrection in Christian tradition. And the logic is simple: both die, both return. Therefore, some claim that the Jesus story is just a reworking of older Near Eastern myths. But that comparison, while superficially tempting, falls apart under scrutiny. Christ's resurrection in Christian theology is a one-time world-altering event, and it's portrayed as the definitive triumph over death and sin, leading to the promise of eternal life for all believers. Inanna's return, by contrast, is part of a cyclical myth tied to the agricultural year and the transits of Venus. Her resurrection doesn't abolish death. It perpetuates the rhythm of death and rebirth in the natural world. As one academic, Tikva Frymer-Kensky, explains, Inanna's descent enacts the fertility cycle, not a redemptive event. So while both myths deal with death and return, their meanings are not the same. Their symbols are not interchangeable, and reducing them to just another resurrection story does both traditions and mythological structures a complete disservice. Another common area where comparative mythology runs into trouble is the category of the so-called dying and rising god. In the 20th century, scholars like James Frazer, in his book The Golden Bough, argued that many ancient traditions and religions throughout the world featured gods who died and returned to life. Osiris in Egypt, Adonis in Greece, Attis in Anatolia, and so on. Frazer believed that these myths reflected early fertility cults and agricultural rituals, and when Jesus appeared on the scene, he was simply the latest incarnation of an old myth. But this theory has been seriously critiqued in recent decades. Jonathan Z. Smith, in his essay Dying and Rising Gods, argues that most so-called dying and rising deities don't actually die and come back in the way that Frazer imagined. Instead, their myths are often about seasonal absence, transformation, or displacement, not literal resurrection. In the case of Dumuzid, for example, or that of his Semitic Akkadian counterpart Tammuz, his death and partial return are part of a shared burden between himself and his sister. Again, a seasonal rhythm tied to plant life and drought, not a narrative of eternal salvation. Smith goes on to write, there is an unambiguous instance in the ancient Near East of a deity truly dying and rising in the way that the term applies. He urges scholars to be precise with their language and avoid imposing uniformity where there is none. And this critique has reshaped how serious scholars approach the question of life, death, and return in myth. And rather than assuming a universal type, they now emphasize cultural specificity, ritual context, and literary nuance. Comparative mythology works best when it respects the integrity of individual traditions. Myths are not just stories, they're embedded in rituals, languages, economies, and worldviews. In Mesopotamian religion, for example, gods were not abstract figures. They were tied to specific cities and temples and social functions. Inanna belonged to Uruk, Enlil to Nippur, Marduk to Babylon. These deities were part of a cosmic hierarchy. Their stories reflected real-world power dynamics, legal practices, and agricultural cycles. As Benjamin Foster notes in Before the Muses, an anthology of Akkadian literature, Mesopotamian myth often served a didactic or ritual purpose. It was less concerned with moral or philosophical truths than with maintaining balance in the cosmos and ensuring the favor of the gods. And this is a far cry from the existential theology of early Christianity or even the metaphysical dualism of Zoroastrianism. Each system developed in response to its own history, its own geography, and its own cultural needs. So while comparison can highlight shared motifs, floods, for example, cosmic battles, trickster figures, it must always return to the local context of each myth and that myth's society. In today's world, comparative mythology has taken on a new life outside the academy, often with mixed results. In online forums, YouTube documentaries, and popular books, you'll frequently encounter claims like Jesus was just a copy of Horus, or all religions say the same thing. These ideas often draw on outdated scholarship or fringe interpretations that ignore decades of critical work. For example, works like Tom Harper's The Pagan Christ or Bill Maher's film Religulous repeat old claims about Christian borrowings from pagan myths, and these comparisons are typically based on cherry-picked details. As Bart Ehrman, a scholar of early Christianity, writes in Did Jesus Exist?, the claim that Jesus was simply a mythological copy of dying and rising gods is not taken seriously by any reputable scholar in the field. And he goes on to criticize such theories for ignoring basic rules of historical comparison. But that's not to say that comparative mythology is useless. Far from it. But it must be approached with rigor, humility, and an appreciation for difference as well as similarity. Despite its challenges, comparative mythology still has enormous value. It helps us see how different cultures respond to common questions. It reveals how myths travel. It reveals how they transform. And it reveals how they adapt. And not just myths, but the cults of the gods that inform those myths. And it reminds us that these stories matter not just because of what they say, but because of how they say it and why they say it. And a responsible comparative approach is one that recognizes both similarity and difference, accounts for ritual, linguistic, and historical context, respects the integrity of each culture and tradition, and my personal favorite, avoids projecting modern or Western categories on to ancient thought and culture. As Wendy Doniger, a prominent scholar of religion and myth, notes in her work, The Implied Spider, Politics and Theology in Myth, the purpose of comparison is not to flatten, but to deepen. Comparison allows us to see what is unique by first seeing what is shared. Comparative mythology isn't about finding carbon copies. It's about mapping the landscape of human imagination, its recurring mountains and valleys, but also its local flora, its unique landmarks. It reminds us that while cultures may ask similar questions, their answers are shaped by language, land, memory, and mythic structure. Speaking of mythic structure, let's rewind to the late 19th century when archaeologists and scholars were on a roll, digging up cuneiform tablets across the region known as Mesopotamia, what's now modern Iraq, and uncovering a treasure trove of ancient texts from liturgy to myth to history to accounting. As these texts were translated, scholars started noticing something curious. Many of these stories sounded oddly familiar. There were tales of a great flood, a creation of the world from chaos, even stories involving divine councils and cosmic battles. To some, it all looks suspiciously like the Hebrew Bible, or perhaps more accurately, the other way around. From this observation emerged a bold and, at the time, sensational theory, that is, Pan-Babylonianism. In essence, Pan-Babylonianism proposed that virtually all ancient myths, religious systems, and even the foundational texts of Judaism and Christianity could be traced back to Babylonian mythology. Now, Babylon, according to this view, wasn't just an ancient empire. It was the spiritual and mythological mother of all religions. And it was a big claim, and for a while it gained a lot of traction. Pan-Babylonianism found fertile ground in the 1880s and 1890s, a time when European scholars were becoming increasingly fascinated by the ancient Near East, and with the decipherment of cuneiform writing and the translation of texts like the Enuma Elish, which is the Babylonian creation epic, and the Epic of Gilgamesh, parallels to biblical stories became hard to ignore. The Enuma Elish, for example, speaks of a chaotic, watery beginning and the separation of heaven and earth, an imagery that bears a striking resemblance to Genesis 1. Similarly, the Epic of Gilgamesh includes a flood narrative, featuring Utnapishtim, or Ziusudra, or Atrahasis, a man who was warned by the god Enki, or Ea, to build a massive boat and save life from a divine deluge. Does that sound familiar? These similarities led scholars like Friedrich Delitzsch to argue that the Hebrew Bible was deeply indebted to Babylonian mythology. His lectures, later published as Babel und Bible, were sort of the most influential early expressions of Pan-Babylonian thinking. He wasn't alone. Authors such as Peter Jensen and Alfred Jeremias doubled down, claiming that even Greek and Roman mythology, Indian cosmology, and Egyptian theology were all downstream of Babylon. Pan-Babylonianism quickly moved from academic speculation to sweeping cultural thesis. According to its more extreme proponents, Babylon wasn't just influential, it was foundational to all religious thought. And there were a few reasons why Pan-Babylonianism was so attractive at the time. First, it offered a unifying theory of religion. If everything could be traced back to Babylon, that made the complex web of ancient mythologies much simpler to understand. It also appealed to Enlightenment and post-Enlightenment sensibilities. In a Europe increasingly skeptical of religious dogma, showing that the Bible shared DNA with quote-unquote pagan myths helped to demystify scripture and undercut claims of divine uniqueness. And second, the theory fit nicely into the colonial worldview at the time. European powers were deeply involved in excavating and collecting the cultural heritage of the Near East, and framing Babylon as the origin of religion helped reinforce the idea that Western civilization was heir to all ancient knowledge. And finally, Pan-Babylonianism was just plain exciting. The idea that buried tablets in Iraq could rewrite the history of religion was irresistible to academics and the public. But not everyone was convinced. Even in its heyday, Pan-Babylonianism had its critics. Scholars like Hermann Gunkel, for instance, while acknowledging some parallels between Mesopotamian and biblical text, urged caution. He pointed out that similar stories could arrive independently in different cultures due to shared human experiences. Take flood stories, for example. These pop up all over the world, from ancient Iraq to Mesoamerica to the Pacific Islands. But that doesn't necessarily mean that every culture was copying Babylon. It might just mean that floods are a universal human concern. Rivers flood, people die, stories get told. Later scholars, including William Foxwell Albright and later generations of biblical archaeologists, push back harder. They argued that the similarities were real, but the notion of a single cultural origin was overly simplistic. Mesopotamian influence on Israelite religion? Sure. But total derivation? Not so fast. And here's where major issues with Pan-Babylonianism become clear. Similarity does not equal dependence. Just because two stories resemble each other does not mean one is a copy of the other. As folklorists have long known, similar myths can develop independently in response to similar existential questions. Again, where do we come from? Why do we suffer? What happens after we die? And Mesopotamian religion was not a single unified system. The religions of Sumer, Akkad, Assyria, and Babylon evolved over thousands of years. Even within Babylon itself, beliefs changed from time to time. Treating Babylonian religion as one fixed system or an orthodoxy is woefully and historically inaccurate. Cultural contact is complex. Ancient Iraq and ancient Palestine, more specifically Judea, did have contact, especially during the Babylonian exile, but influence is not always straightforward or one way. Sometimes influence is resisted, reinterpreted, or selectively integrated. And today, most scholars see Pan-Babylonianism as a historical curiosity, rather than a viable theory. It's an example of what happens when genuine insights get pushed too far. And that said, the theory did contribute something valuable. It opened up serious academic study of Mesopotamian literature and its relationship to biblical texts. And before this, many Western scholars assumed the Bible stood alone. Pan-Babylonianism forced a broader comparative approach. Modern scholars are much more nuanced. They acknowledge that the Hebrew Bible shares a cultural and literary context with the broader ancient Near East, and this includes not only Babylon, but also Canaan and Egypt and others. In this more balanced view, Babylonian mythology is seen as one influence among many, not the single source of all religious thought. Although Pan-Babylonianism is no longer accepted as mainstream scholarship, its echoes still show up in pop culture, conspiracy theories, and some strains of esotericism. For instance, authors like Zecharia Sitchin built elaborate theories of ancient alien contact on the idea that Sumerian and Babylonian myths were literal records of extraterrestrial visitations. Sitchin's work is roundly rejected by scholars, but it has a large following in alternative history cycles. Similarly, some occult and New Age movements lean heavily on the idea that quote-unquote Babylonia or Sumeria held ancient secret wisdom that was later suppressed by institutional religion. And this sort of thinking often draws, consciously or not, on the old Pan-Babylonian model. Even some modern documentaries and YouTube channels make sweeping claims that the Bible is just a copy of earlier myths, often without the nuance or caution that the topic deserves. So where does that leave us? Pan-Babylonianism is a fascinating chapter in the history of ideas. It was born out of genuine discoveries and an understandable desire to find patterns and origins, but it also shows the dangers of overreaching or forcing complex cultural interactions into a single narrative. The real story of religion is far from intricate. It's a tapestry woven from countless threads, local traditions, cultural exchanges, political pressures, theological innovations, and Babylon is a part of that story, but it's not the whole story. Unfortunately, one individual by the name of Alexander Hislop didn't quite see it that way. First published as a pamphlet in 1853 and expanded into a book by 1858, Hislop's manifesto titled The Two Babylons put forward a sweeping and sensational thesis by this overzealous Protestant minister that the Roman Catholic Church was not only corrupt, but is in fact a disguised form of ancient Babylonian paganism. To Hislop, everything from the use of incense and worship to the veneration of Mary, the Pope's title, and the celebration of Christmas were all direct continuations of Babylonian mystery religion. The book is filled with footnotes, historical references, and elaborate charts that lend it an air of scholarship. And to many readers, especially in the 19th and early 20th centuries, it was persuasive. But here's the thing, almost none of it holds up under scrutiny. The Two Babylons is a prime example of a pseudo-historical work that appears scholarly on the surface, but is riddled with logical leaps, misused sources, and deliberate factual errors. So, let's unpack the core of Hislop's argument, examine where it goes wrong, and look at why his ideas, despite being thoroughly debunked, still have staying power in some corners of religious discourse. At the heart of Two Babylons is a basic assumption that similarities between ancient pagan religions and Roman Catholicism prove an indisputable line of direct descent. Hislop argued that after the death of Nimrod, the biblical mighty hunter mentioned in Genesis 10, his equally mythical wife, Semiramis, deified him and established a false religion in Babylon. Or was it Nineveh? Who knows? She and Nimrod supposedly became the prototypes for the mother-son worship cults that were found throughout the ancient world, such as Isis and Horus in Egypt, Venus and Cupid in Rome, and, as Hislop claimed, Mary and Jesus in Catholic Christianity. According to Hislop, the early church fell into apostasy, and what emerged was not Christianity at all, but a recycled form of ancient Babylonian idolatry, dressed in Christian terminology. Rituals such as the Eucharist, confession, prayers for the dead, and the veneration of saints were, as he said, thinly veiled versions of Babylonian ceremonialism. In Hislop's view, Catholicism was not just an error, it was paganism reborn. The two Babylons in the title refer to the ancient city in Mesopotamia and the symbolic Babylon of the Book of Revelation, which he identified as the Catholic Church. Hislop's work gained traction partly because it looked like serious scholarship. He filled the pages with references to ancient texts, historical timelines, and linguistic parallels. The margins were crowded with citations to Herodotus, Plutarch, and the early church fathers. There were family trees, diagrams, and long footnotes. And for readers in the 19th century, many of whom lacked access to primary sources, it gave the impression of academic authority. But as modern historians pointed out, Hislop's methodology was anything but rigorous. Hislop's main tactic was what biblical scholar Samuel Sandmel famously called parallelomania, and that's the tendency to draw sweeping conclusions from superficial similarities between cultures and periods of time. And just because two traditions use similar imagery or rituals does not mean that one borrowed from the other or that they share the same meaning. Here's a simple example. Both ancient Babylonians and Roman Catholics use incense in religious ceremonies. Another anecdotal example is many cultures throughout the world use unleavened bread as a food source. Does that mean that they're all Jewish? No. Hislop sees this and concludes that Catholics must have inherited the practice from Babylon, but this ignores a vast spectrum of possibilities, that similar ritual tools can emerge independently, that their meanings can shift dramatically, and that cultural and historical developments matter. As religious historian Ronald Hutton puts it, using incense is like using fire or water. It's not inherently pagan or Christian. It depends on the symbolism attached. Hislop consistently ignored these distinctions. His book operates on the assumption that similarity is sameness. And that's a fundamental error in both historical reasoning and cultural analysis. Now let's take a look at the small cast of characters that became Hislop's favorite figures. Hislop paints Semiramis as the mother goddess of Babylon, the origin of all Madonna and child worship found allegedly throughout the ancient world, but historically Semiramis was a semi-legendary Assyrian queen, likely based on an individual by the name of Shamiramit, who ruled as regent in the 9th century BCE. Now, there's no evidence that she was ever deified or worshipped in a widespread cult, but that didn't stop him. As historian Stephanie Daly explains in Myths from Mesopotamia, Semiramis is a posthumous legend, not a goddess. Now let's look at Nimrod, who appears in Genesis 10, specifically verses 8 through 12, as a quote-unquote mighty hunter before the Lord and a builder of cities like Babel and Nineveh. But that's it. The Bible gives no further details about his character or religious activities. Hislop, however, turns Nimrod into a full-fledged Babylonian king, a founder of false religion and a godlike figure whose death was mythologized across cultures throughout the ancient world. These claims aren't supported by any primary sources. As Bible scholar John Day notes, Nimrod's transformation into a quasi-divine tyrant is a later Jewish and Christian legend. And finally, we have my favorite, Tammuz, who is a genuine figure from Mesopotamian mythology. Known in Sumerian as Dumuzid, he was the shepherd god associated with fertility and seasonal cycles. And his death and partial return were ritualized in lamentation festivals, especially in the later Babylonian and Assyrian periods. But he was never a quote-unquote savior figure in the sense that Hislop imagines. No personal redemption, no cosmic salvation, no moral judgment whatsoever. Now, one of the most glaring problems in this pastiche that is the two Babylons is Hislop's misuse and sometimes outright misunderstanding of ancient sources. He frequently quotes ancient historians like Herodotus or Plutarch without regard for context, and mixes Greek, Roman, Babylonian, and Egyptian traditions as if they all spoke with one voice. Even worse, he often treats later sources as evidence for ancient beliefs. For example, he cites medieval legends of Renaissance interpretations as they reflect the religious practices of ancient Mesopotamia. He also leans heavily on speculative etymology, connecting words like Yule or Easter to pagan deities without considering linguistic development or alternative explanations. In academic terms, this approach is a methodological disaster, or as one scholar of the Bible put it, pure and utter nonsense. Despite the sensationalism, however, Hislop's theories were already considered shaky by many of his contemporaries. And by the 20th century, scholars across fields of history, theology, linguistics, and religious studies have thoroughly discredited his arguments. Ralph Woodrow, a minister who originally promoted Hislop's ideas in his own book, Babylon Mystery Religion, eventually retracted them. Despite being widely discredited, the two Babylons remains influential, especially in some fundamentalist Protestant circles, conspiracy theory communities, and anti-Catholic literature. And part of this is due to the book's narrative appeal. It provides a simple, dramatic explanation for why Catholicism looks different from modern evangelical Christianity. And it also feeds into broader anxieties about religious authority, tradition, and cultural syncretism. In an area where distrust of institutions runs high, Hislop's work offers a story of corruption, deception, and a secret history which resonates with modern skepticism. Add to that the book's public domain status and its frequent circulation online, and you've got a recipe for viral misinformation that still finds an audience 150 years after its publication. Hislop's The Two Babylons is a case study, if you will, in how not to do comparative religion. And it shows what happens when similarities are mistaken for proof, when context is ignored, and when ideology drives interpretation. There's no question that religious traditions often borrow and adapt elements from earlier cultures. In fact, Christianity itself emerged in a world shaped by Judaism, Hellenism, and Roman imperial power. But drawing direct lines from ancient Babylon to 19th century Catholicism without considering historical development, theological nuance, or cultural context is bad scholarship. Instead of using myth and history as tools for vilification, we should approach them with curiosity, critical thinking, and a commitment to the truth. And that means asking not just what practices look similar, but why they exist, how they evolved, and what they meant to the people who lived them. Let's circle back and talk about James Frazer, one of the most influential and controversial figures in the study of mythology and religion. His magnum opus, The Golden Bough, which was published in 1890 and eventually expanded into 12 volumes by 1915, aimed to uncover the underlying patterns of ancient religion and myth across the world. At the heart of Frazer's theory was a poetic and provocative idea. Many ancient religions revolved around a common archetype he called the dying and rising god. And these were deities who died in some fashion, often violently or tragically, only to be reborn or resurrected. And Frazer believed that this pattern was not only symbolic of seasonal cycles like the dying and rebirth of vegetation, but also served as a psychological and spiritual core of early religious experience. It was bold, it was sweeping, and for decades it shaped how people thought about mythology, religion, and even Christianity. Like his sensational counterpart, Alexander Hislop, unfortunately, Frazer dramatically oversimplified his work. Let's unpack this theory and look at the myths that he used to support it, and explore why most modern scholars now see the dying and rising god as a problematic category. Frazer was heavily influenced by 19th century theories of cultural evolution and early anthropology. He believed that religion evolved in stages from magic to religion to science. And in his view, ancient people created myths to explain natural phenomenon and to ritualize their hope for renewal, especially agricultural renewal, which was central to survival. He saw the dying and rising god myth as a reflection of seasonal death and rebirth, the fading of the crops in winter, and their return in spring. And just as the earth seemed to die and revive, so too did these gods. Frazer grouped together a wide range of figures across cultures to support his theory. Osiris in Egypt, Adonis and Attis in the Greco-Roman world, Tammuz or Dumuzid in Mesopotamia, and yes, even Jesus Christ in Christianity. And to Frazer, this was no coincidence. He believed that these myths reflected a shared psychological and ritual need, a kind of spiritual response to the rhythms of nature and the shared existence of human trauma. One of Frazer's key examples was Osiris, the Egyptian god who was killed by his brother Set and later dismembered, only to be reassembled by his wife and sister Isis. And Frazer interpreted that this was a straightforward death and resurrection story, but there's a problem because Osiris didn't come back to earthly life. In fact, after being reassembled and ritually embalmed, he becomes the ruler of the underworld. He doesn't walk the earth again or resume his kingship in Egypt. His resurrection is a spiritual one, not a physical one. Osiris symbolizes continuity after death, not rebirth in this world. In other words, Osiris may have been reborn in mythic terms, but not in the way that Frazer imagined. Like my pal Hislop, Frazer also leaned heavily on Tammuz. His story is perhaps the closest fit to Frazer's archetype, with Ishtar or Inanna descending to the underworld, dying, being revived, and returning to the world of the living. In order to maintain cosmic balance, however, she chooses Tammuz or Dumuzid to take her place. And now we have our theological outlier. Perhaps most controversially, Frazer included Jesus in his list of dying and rising gods. He saw the resurrection story as just another version of an old mythological pattern, stripped of its ritual context and reframed as a unique event. But unfortunately, this is where Frazer's theory ran into real theological and historical pushback. Early Christianity was explicitly anti-pagan in many ways. The idea that it simply borrowed its core beliefs from fertility cults flies in the face of both textual and historical evidence. Despite its scholarly flaws, the Golden Bough left a lasting mark on the way we talk about myth. It inspired generations of writers, filmmakers, and thinkers to see deeper symbolic connections across cultures. It helped establish myth as a serious field of study. Even if his conclusions were off the mark, Frazer's work also paved the way for thinkers like Joseph Campbell. That said, Frazer's model should now be viewed with the same lens we apply to early scientific theories, important for its historical role, but not accurate by modern standards. His poetic vision helped open the door to comparative mythology, even if we since learned to walk through that door with more care. If nothing else, Frazer reminds us that myths are complicated, and any theory that tries to explain them all in a single pattern probably isn't seeing the full picture. Pan-Babylonianism, Hislop's conspiracy theories, and Frazer's archetypes all promise a grand unifying narrative. They flatten complexity into something easy to grasp and easier to spread. But real history is more complicated than that. Religions are not interchangeable. Myths are not telling the same story. And when we ignore culture and context, we distort meaning. We need to read these myths and rituals on their own terms, in their own languages, and within their own cultural framework. And when we let go of overly neat theories and start listening to the ancient voices themselves, we begin to see just how diverse, creative, and complex human religion really is.